We should expect the theme of chapter 9 to be a reflection of that first revealed in chapter 3, which involved the king of Babylon's rejection of the prophecy concerning the rise and fall of his kingdom. Once again, the king of Babylon in history is a lesson study about the last day king of Babylon in prophecy and what he will be thinking and doing to try and establish a kingdom of his own. At the same time, he will try and stave off the inevitable, as we've already seen in the characterization of the scapegoat. We saw in Daniel 3 that the dimensions of the king's image in verse 1 were not meant to be taken literally. The fact that there are only 2 dimensions given to us means the image couldn't possibly be real, since it would have been thinner than a piece of paper. The width of the image is 6 cubits, which is telling us 2 things. 6 is the number associated with the preparation day that precedes the Sabbath. It represents the incomplete or unfinished work of God's plan at creation. It is in fact the measure of this world's period of probation that must precede the time of the end, which would be the final Sabbath of the Day of Atonement in the day of the Lord. It's understood that 10 is the number of a covenant's relationship. This says to us, given the theme of the narrative, which is the dictate of conscience, the dimensions of the image represent Satan's final attempt to force a covenant relationship on everyone before God will be finished with the business of his final atonement. The fact that the image is all gold also tells us this is a counterfeit of the wisdom of God. Gold is God's symbol of the knowledge of his love revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. The parallel is quite remarkable given the fact that historically the king that would conquer Babylon would begin the process of freeing Israel so that he could return to Palestine in order to rebuild the temple and the city. The rebuilding of the temple is the prophecy of the coming of God's kingdom, which is the plan of redemption finally being fulfilled. Like many of the Psalms, Daniel 9 consists of 2 parts that form what's called an antiphony. One party calls out while the other responds in a kind of back and forth cadence or chant. Perhaps you've seen soldiers do it when they march with their drill sergeant. In Daniel 9, the call is Daniel's prayer. The response is Gabriel's commentary. In 19 verses, the prophet very eloquently states what was Israel's problem. His call explains why the nation was being punished, stating clearly that God had every right to do so. In verses 20 through 27, the angel Gabriel responds to his call. He tells Daniel, even as he was in the midst of his prayer, God was sending him an answer. The Bible says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years, whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. We have sinned and have committed iniquity and have done wickedly and have rebelled, even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants, the prophets, In Daniel 9, the chapter begins with Daniel's prayer that puts everything in its proper perspective. Daniel acknowledges the truth, which is that while God had been faithful, just, and merciful, Israel had done wickedly. Daniel says the punishment received was the punishment deserved. He then states that Israel has served his time in exile according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah. Daniel's prayer is referred to in Leviticus 16 as the sole affliction that God calls for in the Day of Atonement. God says for his true church, the close of probation and the end of the world will involve a sincere and honest confession concerning the sins of the past in our failing to live up to our profession of faith. And whilst I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, whilst I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel touched me about the time of the evening oblation. In verse 21, Daniel says the angel Gabriel came to him about the time of the evening oblation, which is critically important to understand because that was when the angel touched him. To touch is to anoint, which means Daniel was chosen and thus prepared for what will be the Last Supper. Notice that Daniel says he was praying to the Lord his God for the holy mountain of my God. Daniel was praying concerning the mountain of the covenant, which is in this case Mount Zion, the mountain of the new covenant. By its very definition, soul affliction is what the experience of the Last Supper is supposed to involve. That is what it ultimately became for the Lord's disciples, and the fact that the Lord told us to commemorate the occasion was him telling us that it will also be our experience as well. Daniel's prayer means the church will experience the Last Supper for one last time. Additionally, the holy mountain of God, being Mount Zion, refers to both the rebuilding of the city and the temple in Daniel's day and the experience of the new covenant and the final atonement in our day. The question is, why is Gabriel touching Daniel during the time of the evening sacrifice? The Bible says, I saw in my vision by night. The night vision that Daniel received concerned the four winds of the heaven. We understand this to mean the coming of God's kingdom that will be realized as the final harvest of the earth will then be gathered in. It's most appropriate that Daniel would be touched or anointed during the time of this, the evening sacrifice, because the angel says, I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the matter and consider the vision. Daniel was greatly beloved because he is a representation of the bride of Christ, whom God is about to marry. The last day church will understand the matter concerning the vision. We understand that the marriage of the Lamb is the heart of the matter because it will be the ratification of the new covenant. The understanding mentioned here concerns the vision that God has shown Daniel, which covers chapters 1 through 8. That would explain why Daniel was considering by books the number of the years which was the time of Israel's exile. Israel returning to its homeland is the prophecy turning a proverbial corner. The time of Israel's exile is over. The people can now return to Palestine. Now comes the final episode of Israel's covenant experience. "70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy." The context of this verse refers to the close of probation for two distinct parties. While the 70 weeks refers to the end of Israel's probation, the 7 things listed here concern the final atonement. This list of 7 promises would not be fulfilled during the time of Christ's ministry, and God does tell us why. The prophecy is measured in terms of weeks rather than days, months, or years. This necessarily concerns 2 things, both of which define the covenant relationship. First, the week is always a unit of measure that points us back to the creation narrative. The week in the beginning referred to the entire plan of redemption, which will end with the rest of the Sabbath. This would be a problem with respect to the first Israel's covenant relationship, precisely because Daniel says Israel would fail to honor the Sabbath. The goal of God's plan would never be reached. And secondly, God also says, "Fulfill her week, which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years." And Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. In the story of Jacob, the point is made that his first marriage was not what he intended for it to be. Leah was not his beloved, which is God's point made concerning the marriage. In the biblical narrative, 2 different people were married to 2 different women. Jacob was the liar and the deceiver that was represented as the evening sacrifice, characteristically speaking. Jacob's marriage was consummated in the dark. He couldn't see the woman that he married precisely because he'd been deceived by his uncle. Likewise, Leah couldn't see straight either because she was cross-eyed. On the other hand, Israel, who would be Jacob the overcomer, was that person having a totally different experience because he had a totally different character. The beauty of the story was that his love for Rachel is what converted him. He fulfilled her week, which meant his dream of marrying her would no longer be deferred, which is the moral of the story. As a nation, Jacob represented all of his offspring that would marry a cross-eyed woman in the darkness of night, having been deceived. Jacob married Rachel 7 years later in the light of day, which was the prophecy of his being converted. Having met the Lord at the river Jabbok in the middle of the night, his faith was finally put to the ultimate test, and he prevailed. Hence the name change. He would have a son by Rachel named Joseph, who would be in every way a type of Christ, as we saw in the study of the white linen curtain of the tabernacle. The fact that the last years of Israel's history would be measured as a period of 70 weeks says in no uncertain terms God was deferring or putting off the wedding until a later time. Jacob marrying Leah was Israel's failed covenant relationship in a figure. Their marriage explains what would be the end of Israel's covenant relationship. It consisted of a list of 7 different failed or deferred promises that would be met when Israel would marry the right woman, because she would be his true bride. This list concerns what God was referring to in the very beginning in Daniel chapter 1 verses 1 and 2. Israel neglecting the Sabbath for 490 years was why God exiled the nation and allowed Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the temple. The number 490 was always the key. Thy people and thy holy city refers to the dual nature of the prophecy. On the one hand, there was the nation held in captivity for 70 years. The majority of those people never returned to Palestine after their 70 years were finished. Then there were those that came out of Babylon after their period of exile. 7 things listed here refers to Daniel and those that returned to Palestine to rebuild the New Jerusalem. They represent God's last day church. The point of the prophecy is the city and the people that occupy it. If the city is destroyed, the point is made that the people have fatally broken their covenant relationship. The Lord told Peter 490 was the measure of his forgiveness. He forgave Israel in the beginning for what would happen in the end, because he would allow Israel to return to Palestine and rebuild the walls and the temple, knowing full well that he would be rejected and crucified. His forgiveness granted the nation 490 more years of time, which he refers to as a period of 70 weeks. Clearly, the numeric language that God uses here tells the story. 10 is the number of the covenant relationship, while 7 always represents the end of something. Therefore, the 70 weeks represents the end of Israel's covenant relationship with God and a marriage that would be deferred until later.